The Vulcan ship landed on Earth on a Tuesday morning in June. The reptilian aliens stepped out onto the platform built specially for them, their scales gleaming green and gold in the sunlight. They stood taller than most humans, with thick armored skin that had protected their species for millions of years. Ambassador Thesic led the group, his eyes sharp and calculating as he surveyed the crowd of humans waiting to greet them. The Galactic Council had chosen the Vulcan for first contact because they were survivors. Their home world was harsh, covered in volcanoes and poisonous swamps. They had lived through ice ages and meteor strikes. They were proud of their strength, their natural armor, their ability to endure what would kill softer species. Humans, by contrast, seemed painfully fragile to Thesic. Their skin was thin and easily damaged. They had no scales, no shells, no thick hide. They wore clothes because their own bodies couldn't handle their planet's weather. They were weak, Thesic thought, but perhaps clever enough to be useful to the Council. The first week of cultural exchange went smoothly. The Vulcan delegation stayed in the newly built Interspecies Embassy in New York City. Human scientists asked endless questions about Vulcan technology and biology. Human children pressed their faces against barriers to stare at the aliens with wonder. Thesic found their curiosity charming, if naive. On the 8th day, something went wrong. A plasma conduit in the embassy's power core ruptured without warning. The safety systems failed. In seconds, superheated plasma flooded through 3 city blocks. The temperature spiked to over 2,000 degrees. Metal melted. Glass turned to liquid. The air itself seemed to catch fire. The Vulcan reacted instantly. Their survival instincts, honed over millions of years, took control. They ran. Their heat-resistant scales could handle high temperatures, but not this. Thesic felt his scales smoking as he sprinted toward the evacuation point. Behind him, he heard the screams of humans caught in the inferno. He kept running. Survival came first. That was nature's law. The weak perished so the strong could live out at the safety perimeter. Thesic counted his delegation. 23 adults present. But the hatchling, young Krell, was missing. His parents stood frozen, their faces twisted with grief. They had left him behind in their panic. The shame was crushing, but what could they do? The fire was too hot. Going back meant death. Then Thesic saw something that would haunt him forever. Human firefighters were suiting up, preparing to enter the blaze. Their equipment was primitive compared to Vulcan technology. Thick coats, helmets with face shields, breathing tanks. The suits were rated for perhaps 800 degrees, maybe 1,000 for brief moments. The fire was twice that hot. "You cannot go in there," Thesic said to the nearest firefighter, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid. Her name tag read Santos. "Your equipment will fail. You will die." Maria Santos adjusted her breathing mask and looked at him with calm brown eyes. "People are still inside," she said simply. "Someone has to go get them." "The survival rate is 0, Thesic insisted. "Logic demands retreat." "Logic doesn't know my team," Maria said. She turned to her crew. "Standard search pattern. Work in pairs. You've got maybe 5 minutes before your gear fails. Use them well." Thesic watched in disbelief as 12 humans walked into the fire. The minutes crawled by. Thesic's translator device picked up the radio chatter between the firefighters. Their voices stayed steady, even as they reported temperatures that should have killed them instantly. They moved through the burning buildings, calling out for survivors, refusing to leave anyone behind. Maria's voice came over the radio. "I've got a Vulcan child, southeast corner of the embassy. He's alive, but scared. Coming out now." Thesic's heart, which beat differently than a human's, but felt the same emotions, clenched in his chest. She had found Krell. She was bringing him out, but the route Maria had taken was collapsing. Thesic heard the groan of metal, the crash of falling debris. Maria's suit alarms were screaming. The heat-reflective coating was failing. Her breathing was labored. "Santos, abort!" the fire chief ordered over the radio. "The building is coming down." "Almost there," Maria gasped. "I've got him. I've got the kid." She emerged from the fire 30 seconds before the building collapsed behind her. Her suit was melting, pieces of it dripping away like wax. The skin on her arms was red and blistered where the suit had failed. She stumbled, fell to her knees, but she held Krell carefully, protecting his small body with hers. Medics rushed forward. They took Krell from Maria's arms. The little Velkin hatchling was frightened but unharmed. Maria collapsed face first onto the concrete. Desik could see the burns covering her back, her arms, her neck. 40% of her body, he learned later. The medical team surrounded her immediately. Over the next hour, more humans emerged from the fire. Some carried Velkin embassy staff. Others carried human civilians. They came out burned, choking, their equipment destroyed. 2 humans didn't come out at all. They had stayed inside too long, making sure everyone else got out first. 10 more died in the hospital over the next 3 days, but 43 people lived. 43 lives saved because someone went back for them. Desik sat in the hospital waiting room, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. Krell's parents were with their son, crying tears of joy and shame. They had abandoned their child. A stranger, a fragile human, had burned herself to bring him back. When Maria woke 3 days later, Desik was granted permission to visit. She lay in a medical pod, her burns wrapped in regenerative bandages. She looked small and weak in the hospital bed. But Desik saw her differently now. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you burn for a stranger's child? Your survival instincts should have stopped you. Nature's law is to preserve yourself." Maria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from smoke damage. "Maybe human nature is different," she said. "Someone had to go get him. So I went. You nearly died." "But he didn't," Maria said. "That's what matters." Desik left the hospital with a new understanding. Humans weren't weak. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. They were something dangerous and beautiful and completely insane. They would burn themselves to save others. They would die for strangers. They would run into fires when every instinct should make them flee. The Velkin were survivors. They were strong, armored, logical. But humans had something Desik's people had lost long ago. Something that couldn't be killed by fire or logic or fear. They had a will that said no one. Burns alone. 10 years passed after the fire. The story spread across the Galactic Council like ripples in water. Some species found it inspiring. Others found it disturbing. A species willing to die for strangers was unpredictable, possibly dangerous to themselves and others. The Council accepted humanity as junior members, but kept them at arm's length. Humans were assigned to low-risk positions, kept away from critical decisions. They were too emotional. The Council agreed. Too impulsive. They needed to be controlled for their own good. Earth didn't argue. Humans took their minor roles and learned everything they could about galactic civilization. They studied alien languages, cultures, technologies. They built ships and established colonies. They waited patiently for a chance to prove themselves. That chance came in the form of a plague. The Trellin were a silicon-based species, living on 7 heavily populated worlds in the galactic core. They looked like living crystals, their bodies composed of complex silicate structures. They communicated through light pulses that sparkled across their surfaces. They were peaceful, artistic, beloved by most of the Council. The plague of Eshrak hit their worlds without warning. It was a silicon-targeted pathogen, possibly engineered, possibly natural. No one knew where it came from. What they knew was that it spread fast and killed 70% of those infected. The Trellon's crystalline bodies would cloud over, their light dimming until it went out entirely. The plague was extremely contagious. The Trellon couldn't safely treat their own sick without protective equipment they didn't have enough of. Carbon-based species couldn't help because the containment requirements were impossibly expensive. Each treatment team needed sealed environment suits that cost more than a small spaceship. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions. They debated for 3 weeks while millions of Trellon died. The conclusion was logical, if heartbreaking. They would quarantine the infected worlds. Let the plague burn itself out. Save the majority by sacrificing the sick. The Trellon matriarch, her light dim with grief, accepted the decision. What choice did she have? Then Dr. James Chun of Earth requested to address the council. Chun was an epidemiologist, one of hundreds of human scientists who had been studying galactic diseases since first contact. He was 50 years old, with gray streaking his black hair and tired eyes that had seen too many outbreaks. He stood before the council chamber and presented his proposal in a calm, measured voice. Human immune systems are adaptable, he said. More adaptable than most carbon-based species. We've analyzed the plague of Ashrak. It can jump to humans, but our preliminary models suggest we can develop treatments if we study it in real time in the hot zones. The infection rate for humans would be catastrophic, a council member objected. You would need to work in close contact with infected Trellon, in sealed environments where the pathogen concentrates. Your people would die. Some of us, yes, Chun agreed. We estimate a 30% mortality rate for human medical teams. Maybe higher. The council chamber fell silent. Finally, the council speaker said what everyone was thinking. We cannot ask anyone to accept those odds. It would be murder. Chun smiled slightly. It wasn't a happy expression. You're not asking, he said. We're volunteering. I've already received applications from over 20,000 human medical personnel. We can have teams on Trellon worlds within 48 hours. This is madness, another council member said. Your species would sacrifice thousands of lives on the chance of saving others? Not on a chance, Chun corrected. On a certainty. If we do nothing, millions of Trellon will die. If we try, we'll save most of them. That makes the math simple for us. The council debated for another week. In the end, they authorized the human mission, though many members voted against it. They called it a tragedy waiting to happen. They said humans were too young a species to understand what they were committing to. Earth sent 15,000 medical volunteers to Trellon Space. Dr. Chen led the first team himself. They arrived on Trellon Prime wearing modified hazmat suits, carrying equipment adapted from human disease response protocols. The Trellon watched them work with a mixture of hope and horror. These soft aliens were walking into certain infection to help a species they barely knew. The work was brutal. The medical teams rotated in 6-hour shifts, knowing that each exposure increased their infection risk. They studied the pathogen under field conditions, developed treatments through trial and error, taught Trellon survivors how to care for their own. When a human got infected, they isolated themselves and became test subjects, documenting their symptoms to help refine the treatments. Chun caught the plague in the 3rd week. His crystalline infection started in his lungs, silicon structures forming where they shouldn't exist. He kept working from his isolation bed, analyzing samples and directing his teams until he couldn't breathe anymore. He died watching data streams on his tablet, adjusting treatment protocols until a moment his heart stopped. 4,000 humans died over 6 months. Some from the plague, others from exhaustion, a few from accidents in the desperate conditions of the hot zones. But 8 million Trellon lived, pulled back from death by treatments developed in those terrible months. When the plague finally burned out, the Trellon matriarch came to Earth. She stood before the human memorial where 4,000 names were carved in black stone. Her crystalline body pulsed with colors humans had learned meant deep emotion. "Your people burned for mine," she said through her translator. "Not because you had to. Not because we could repay you. But because someone had to, and you chose to be that someone." She addressed the Galactic Council the next day. Her voice, usually soft and musical, carried steel underneath. 10 years ago, Ambassador Desic told me a human ran into fire to save a Vulcan child. I thought it was one person, one moment of madness. But I was wrong. This is who they are. All of them. This is what they do. The council chambers were quiet. Species that had dismissed humans as reckless or naive now saw them differently. The beings who looked so fragile, who had no armor or weapons or ancient technology, had walked into hell to save strangers. And they would do it again. Fear and respect, Desic thought from his seat in the Vulcan delegation. The galaxy was learning to feel both toward humanity, but the real test was still coming. The fire had shown human courage. The plague had shown human determination. But war would show what humans truly were when everything burned, and war was already on its way. The Kethrin Confederacy emerged from unexplored space like a storm. They were a hive mind species, millions of individual bodies controlled by networked intelligence nodes. They saw the Galactic Council's diversity as weakness, a fracture waiting to split apart. They wanted the galaxy unified under their control, every species absorbed into the collective consciousness. Their first strike was perfectly coordinated. 3 frontier worlds attacked simultaneously. The defensive fleets stationed there were destroyed in hours. The Kethrin didn't bother with occupation. They sent their ultimatum from orbit while their weapons charged. Surrender the entire frontier sector or watch 15 billion lives burn when they glassed the planets. The Galactic Council emergency session lasted 2 days. Military strategists presented their analysis. The Kethrin had over 2,000 warships, all operating with perfect coordination through their hive mind. The Council could win eventually, but not in time to save the frontier. The logical choice was to evacuate who they could, fortify the core worlds, and cede the territory. 15 billion people would die, but it would save the majority. Logic demanded it. The human delegation requested a recess. They returned 4 hours later. Admiral Elena Volkov, commander of Earth's combined fleet, stood to address the council. She was 45, with steel-gray hair and a scar across her left cheek from a training accident years ago. Her uniform was crisp, her bearing military perfect. "Earth fleet is jumping to the frontier," she announced. "We'll hold at New Perth until civilian evacuation is complete." The council speaker stared at her. "Admiral, Earth's fleet is 300 ships. The Kethrin have 2,000. Your survival rate is 0. This is suicide." "Yes," Volkov agreed. "But 2 million humans live on New Perth. 13.7 billion others live there too. We're not leaving them." "You cannot save them," a council member said. "Your fleet will be destroyed, and the evacuation will fail anyway. You're throwing away lives for nothing." "No," Volkov said quietly. "We're buying time. Every hour we hold is another million people on evacuation ships. If we can give them 3 days, most will escape. That's not nothing." The council voted to forbid the mission. Humanity's representative, Ambassador Marcus Okafor, stood and spoke clearly so the chamber's recorders would capture every word. "Then note in your official records that humanity committed suicide today. We're going anyway. New Perth is our home too. And we don't abandon family." Earth's fleet jumped 6 hours later. 300 human ships emerged at New Perth and immediately formed a defensive sphere around the planet. The Kethrin fleet arrived 12 hours after that, descending on the human formation like a hammer on an anvil. Admiral Volkov positioned her flagship, the Indomitable, at the center of the formation and broadcast on all channels. All ships, this is Volkov. Our job is simple. We hold. We don't need to win, just buy time. Every minute matters. Make them pay for every meter. The battle was slaughter. The Catherine focused fire with hive mind precision, overwhelming human shields and tearing through armor. Human ships exploded one after another, bright flowers of death blooming in the void. But each ship took time to kill, and time was what mattered. The human fleet adapted. When their weapons failed, they rammed. Destroyers overloaded their reactors and dove into Catherine cruisers, taking them down in nuclear fire. Frigates used themselves as shields for larger ships. Fighter pilots made suicide runs on enemy engines. Evacuation ships away. Someone reported on hour 36. 3 billion evacuated. Hold the line, Volkov ordered. Half her fleet was gone. The Catherine adjusted their tactics. They tried to break through the human formation to strike the evacuation ships directly. Every time they pushed, humans filled the gap with their own ships. Metal and bodies, buying seconds that became minutes, that became hours. 6 billion evacuated, came the report at hour 50. Volkov's flagship was on fire. Her bridge crew was mostly dead. She was bleeding from a dozen wounds, but she stayed in her chair and kept giving orders. All remaining ships, Titan formation. We hold until the last transport is away. 10 billion evacuated. The report came at hour 65. The Catherine were pulling back, regrouping for a final overwhelming push. They had lost 300 ships to human tactics, an exchange rate they hadn't anticipated. But they still had 1,700 ships to humanity's 41. 14.8 billion evacuated. Came the final report at hour 72. All transports away. Evacuation complete. Volkov closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and smiled. All ships, job done. Time to avenge, the sensor operator interrupted. Admiral, incoming jump signatures. Multiple fleets. 7 council species had sent their military forces. The 6 Vulcan fleet arrived first, followed by the Trellin crystal ships, then others. 2,000 council warships dropped into normal space and fell on the Catherine's flanks. The Catherine, used to perfect coordination, panicked. They had never faced an enemy willing to die to buy time for others. They retreated, their formation collapsing. Volkov's last transmission before the Indomitable's reactor went critical was calm and clear. To all council ships, thank you for coming. To Earth, mission accomplished. 14.8 billion souls evacuated. We held. Tell them. Tell them we held. The Indomitable exploded, taking a Catherine battleship with it. 41 human ships survived out of 300. But the Catherine offensive was broken. With 7 council fleets now committed, the war turned. 3 months later, the Catherine retreated back into unexplored space. Their fleet shattered. The victory celebration on Earth was muted. 12% of humanity had died in the war. The scars would take generations to heal. But across the galaxy, something fundamental had changed. The Council erected a monument at New Perth. 300 ship names carved in stone, each representing a crew that knew they would die and jumped anyway. Species that had called humans reckless or suicidal now called them something else. Heroes, protectors, the ones who would burn so others could live. But Desik, now old and gray-scaled, wondered if they understood the real lesson. Humans didn't fight because they were brave. They fought because they had seen too many fires, too many plagues, too many moments when someone had to act. And somewhere in their strange evolution, they had decided that someone would always be them. The galaxy was safer because of it. And more dangerous too, because now everyone knew what humans would do. They would burn. Every single time. A century passed. Humanity was no longer the young species that had stumbled into galactic politics with wide eyes and naive hope. They were respected, feared, loved, and sometimes resented. They had colonies on 100 worlds. Their ships patrolled trade routes. Their scientists worked on council research projects. But more than anything, they had become a measuring stick. Would a human do this? Became a phrase spoken in a dozen languages on 1,000 worlds. Sometimes it was genuine respect. Sometimes it was sarcasm from species tired of humanity's reputation for suicidal heroism. But everyone knew what it meant. It meant choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. It meant running toward danger instead of away. It meant burning if that's what it took to save others. Ambassador Li Shen represented Earth at the council now. She was Maria Santos's great-granddaughter, though she had never met the woman whose genes she carried. Maria had died of complications from her burns when Li's grandfather was just a child. But Li had grown up with her great-grandmother's story, visited her name on memorials, understood the weight of that legacy. The council called an emergency session to discuss the Ural situation. The Ural were a primitive species, just beginning to develop industrial technology on their home world. Council observation posts had been monitoring them for decades, following the standard non-interference protocols. But stellar surveys revealed a problem. The Ural sun was dying prematurely, destabilized by processes the scientists didn't fully understand. In 50 years, the Ural homeworld would be uninhabitable. The species would go extinct. The debate followed predictable patterns. Some species argued for intervention. Others cited the Prime Directive protocols that prevented interference with developing species. What right did the council have to change the natural course of events? What if intervention caused unforeseen consequences? The arguments went in circles for weeks. Li Shen listened quietly, taking notes, saying little. Finally, the council speaker called for her input. Ambassador Li, humanity has remained notably silent during these debates. What is Earth's position? Li stood. She was 53, with her great-grandmother's dark eyes and steady presence. She looked around the chamber at representatives from 300 worlds. Some were her friends. Some distrusted humanity's influence. All watched her carefully. "We've had this argument before," Li said quietly. "We had it when my great-grandmother ran into fire to save a Vulcan child she'd never met. We had it when Dr. James Chen led 15,000 humans into a plague zone to save the Trellin. We had it when Admiral Volkov's fleet jumped to New Perth, knowing they would die." She paused, letting her words sink in. Every single time, humanity answered the same way. Someone has to help. And if we can help but choose not to, what are we? What is this council worth? The cost, a counselor began. Is irrelevant, Li interrupted, her voice sharp now. Because the alternative is watching 53 billion Ural die when we have the power to save them. We can debate philosophy and principles and the Prime Directive. But while we debate, that sun keeps dying. Those people keep living their lives, having children, building civilizations, not knowing their entire species is doomed. And if we interfere and something goes wrong? Another counselor asked. We could cause more harm than we prevent. Then we'll deal with those consequences, Li said. But I would rather face the consequences of trying to help than live with the certainty of doing nothing. My great-grandmother made that choice in seconds. Dr. Chun made it knowing he would die. Admiral Volkov made it for her entire fleet. Are we, with all our power and knowledge, too afraid to make it too? The silence in the chamber was heavy. Finally, Vesic stood. He was ancient now, his scales pale and cracked with age. He had to use a support frame to stand upright. But his voice was still strong. I have lived long enough to see humanity change the galaxy, Desic said. I was there when a human burned herself to save my species' child. I watched humans walk into plague zones and war zones and every kind of hell imaginable. And every time, I thought, this time they'll learn. This time, they'll choose survival over sacrifice. He looked directly at Lee. But they never do. Because this is who you are. Who you've always been. And perhaps this is who we all should be. He turned to the council. The Vulcan vote to save the Ural. We will commit ships and resources to the effort. Because a human taught me, a century ago, that someone has to go into the fire. And I'm ashamed it took me this long to learn that lesson. One by one, species stood and pledged support. The Trellin, who had never forgotten the plague. The 7 species who had jumped to New Perth. Others who had been inspired by human courage or shamed by human sacrifice. Others still who simply decided that if humanity could burn for strangers, they could at least offer help when it was safer. The vote was called. 268 species voted to save the Ural. 32 abstained. 0 voted against. The Great Relocation began. It took 40 years. Human engineers designed the orbital platforms that would lift Ural cities into space. Trellin artists taught the Ural about the galaxy that awaited them. Vulcan pilots flew the transport ships. 300 species contributed ships, resources, personnel, and expertise to the largest humanitarian mission in galactic history. The Ural were terrified at first. How could they not be? Strange beings descended from the sky and told them their sun was dying, that they had to leave their world or perish. But the council workers were patient. They showed the Ural the data, taught them to read stellar surveys, let them verify the truth for themselves, and then they worked alongside the Ural to save them. 50-3 billion Ural were relocated to 3 new worlds, terraformed and prepared for them. The cost was staggering, measured in decades of labor and resources that could have been used elsewhere. Some council members grumbled about the expense, but no one seriously suggested stopping. On the final day, when the last transport lifted off from the Ural home world, Li Shen stood on the observation deck and watched the sun that had birthed a species prepare to die. Beside her, a young Ural scientist named Kareth looked at the same view, tears streaming down her face. Why? Kareth asked in halting galactic common. Why save us? We had nothing to offer you. We didn't even know you existed. Li thought about her great-grandmother, who she'd never met but whose choice had shaped her entire life. She thought about Dr. Chun, whose sacrifice she had studied in school. She thought about Admiral Volkov, whose statue stood in New York beside Maria Santos's name on the memorial wall. Because someone had to, Li said simply. And because we've learned that the galaxy is better when no one burns alone. Years later, after Li had retired and returned to Earth, Desic made one final journey. He was dying, his body finally giving out after a century and a half of life. He came to Earth to see the memorial one last time. The black stone wall with 4,000 names from the plague, 300 ship names from New Perth, and Maria Santos's name at the very beginning where it all started. A human child, maybe 8 years old, was there with her school class. She read the names aloud, learning the history. When she got to Maria Santos, she paused and asked her teacher, why did she go into the fire? Didn't she know she would get hurt? The teacher knelt down beside her student. She knew. But someone had to save that little alien child. So she went. But she got burned really bad, the child said, troubled. Yes, the teacher agreed. But the child lived. And that mattered more to her. The child thought about this seriously. Finally, she nodded, accepting the logic of it in the way children accept the rules of the world they're born into. Okay, that makes sense. Someone has to help. Desik felt something break and heal simultaneously in his chest. This child, born a century after the fire, understood instantly what had taken him years to comprehend. It was simply how humans were raised, how they thought, who they were. He approached Li Shen one last time before returning to his ship for the final journey home. They sat in a garden, surrounded by earth flowers that would have seemed alien to both their ancestors.